What I want to start with is just some background facts that we have, and to put things in perspective, the current population of the Arab world is 40 million, and it is growing at 2% per year, with 60% of this population living in urban settlements. That's a growth of 2 times since 1960. So it's in 50 years plus, it has doubled, and it's going to increase some more. And that is a great area of concern for us. Agriculture accounts for more than 80% of the water use, and energy consumption in the Middle East is growing at 4.6% per year, and with most of it coming from gas. It has shifted from oil a little bit. And the interesting fact is that renewable energy is still a limited of limited use, with hydropower providing only 2% of the region's electricity. Solar is coming in, but it's still not as dominant as it could be. And the key factor, the key thing about the Middle East is that it is one of the most water scarce regions in the world, if not the most water scarce. And this figure here shows that the dark red parts are the more highly stressed or more severely scarce parts of the world. And you can see most of them are contained in the Middle East and the North Africa region. And to add to the energy use, and if you look at the energy use in the Arab world, it is way higher than the world average. And this is striking, but when you look at where that energy is going, in Saudi Arabia, for example, 65% of domestic oil use is used for desalination, with 1.5 million barrels of oil a day used to desalinate 24 million cubic meters of water. And if this trend of use of water continues, 10% of oil revenue of the Gulf countries, Cooperation Council countries, will go to subsidizing water sector. And this is a whole lot, and this is going to touch upon these countries' economy. In the Middle East, the countries of the MENA region are net importers of food, and we import food from various parts of the world, and you can see where it comes from. And the thicker the line is, the more we import water in the form of food. And you can see it's literally from all over the place. We've got North America, South America, and Asia are the main sources. So the Middle East is water scarce, food/land scarce, if you will, arable land scarce, and we are rich in energy, but that energy is being used greatly in desalinating and making water and food available. When we look at what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change projections show, it shows clearly that temperature response is going to be higher on an annual average. Winter average still a little bit higher, but then significantly higher over summer. Precipitation is going to be reduced overall, and that is where we start running into trouble. So what have we been seeing, and what does it mean for us? The projections for the Arab world itself says that overall we expect a decline in rainfall for most countries, with droughts becoming more likely and more frequent and more severe and lasting longer, especially in the Mediterranean region. The monsoon would intensify and move further, and that affects basically the Arabian Peninsula. So it is important for us to keep that in mind, because the Arab world is not one monolithic entity. It is made up of different parts, and the Mediterranean rim is one, the Arabian Peninsula is another, but they are all responding to similar stresses. There is increased risk of floods, and especially flooding from coastal in coastal areas due to sea level rise and storm surges. We have seen and we'll expect to see heat waves increasing and becoming more frequent and protracted. This, along with the dryness, is going to increase the risk of fire And these three things, dryness, heat waves, fires, are going to also increase dust and sandstorms. So it's not a good concoction that we're getting into. And when we put all this in front of us and then look at how capable we are in terms of adapting to this changing environment, this changing climate, we see that we have very poor adaptive capacity. The darker the color, the poorer the adaptive capacity is. So this part of the world is not well equipped to adapt. Libya here has no data in it, so it's not that. There is nothing. So, excuse me. So, moving on, what have we been seeing? I mean, these are all the projections that have been around, and you can read a lot about that. But what have we been really seeing? And not a lot of what we're seeing may be tied directly to climate change, but this is sort of our window into the future and what will be happening. Between 1980 and 2008, 37 million people in the MENA region were affected by climate disasters, natural disasters, with $20 billion loss in that part of the world. And some of the numbers that we have generated at AUB, and I'd like to share with you. This is a study we had done on data collected at AUB since 1874, all the way up and supplemented by data from the government since the 1930s on rainfall. The thing is, rainfall in Beirut has not changed. And we did a similar study just a month ago on the Bekaa region, that's the inland part of Lebanon. And again, the rainfall on average has not changed. So we keep that in mind. But what has changed, and what is striking and scary, is that the minimum temperature over the same 150 years, let's say, approximately, has increased, and it has increased by about 3 degrees Celsius. The reason this is significant is that countries like Lebanon rely greatly on snow melt to recharge groundwater. And when snow doesn't stick on the ground, there's no recharge. And this is where our water, and everything being constant, this recharge is gone. So we have a problem here. The other problem is, and we've modeled this as an example for what happens as temperature and precipitation change, we went and modeled evapotranspiration at different changes. And we found that on average in Lebanon, we have one drought year every 6 to 10 years. And with time and with this scenario that we had built up, we will have a normal year every 6 years. So this is being actually, if we follow up and see, this is reflected in the drought incidence that we have in Lebanon. And you can see that in the past 20 years or so, 30 and adding on, there's a cluster. The droughts are clustering around more and more in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. What we have seen as well, and I've taken this from NASA, we've seen tremendous dust storms. This is the eastern Mediterranean, but similarly we find the same pattern also occurring in the Arabian Peninsula. We have droughts, and this is the famous drought that everybody claims that is part of the Syrian war. I won't touch that. But the drought in 2008 extended from Turkey, central Turkey, all the way into Iraq and Iran. And this is the Qadisiyya Reservoir in 2009, and in 2006, just at the onset of the drought, you can see how filled up it was. What is also interesting is that disease infestation becomes rampant. I don't know how well you can see that, but this green area was in March to April 2010. That's at the very end of the drought era period. And when this is the color, it's comparison in color to the average year 2000 to 2009. And then the brown part is where the rust set in and destroyed the product, the productivity or the yield. And that's in June. The environment is such that it goes and reduces production, and the environment caused by the drought and then followed by the rains really was amenable for the yellow rust to start. We have floods, and I have nice, sort of interesting pictures. Morocco, we had 89 dead in 2010 and damages in the millions of dollars. Saudi Arabia, out of all places, in Jeddah, look at that. And that's just the tip of the iceberg in May 2013. Jordan and Lebanon. And this is not because of poor infrastructure, that plays a part, but that's because of torrential rain. Again, this is when we're talking about the monsoon shifting up. Cyclones also, which occur in that part of the world, also shift up with it. And Oman suffered greatly in 2007 with 78 dead, 37 million, and nearly $4 billion worth of damage. Heightened storm surges. This is along the Corniche in Lebanon. This is the Sidon, I don't know, Greco-Roman, Phoenician. You can go back as far as you want, but that's the citadel that we have. And look at the damage this has caused for the infrastructure. The reason I'm showing all this is that the damage that climate change causes is direct in agriculture, it's direct on infrastructure, and direct on people and health. So, let alone talk about industry and what else that we can have. What does this all mean for us in our part of the world? Just trying to put in some numbers to the damage that we have. A study we conducted with Sao Paulo University on the impact, the higher order impact of climate change on agriculture. And we found out that a reduced agricultural yield of 3 to 10% would be reflected in 3.5 to 7.75% reduction in GDP. Keeping in mind that agriculture contributes only 2% to Lebanon's GDP. So that's just from the perspective of agriculture. The Ministry of Environment in Lebanon did another study, and they estimated that by 2020, direct cost and foregone GDP would total about $2 billion in 2020, rising to about $140 billion in 2080. And for a country like Lebanon, that's a whole lot. It's a huge amount that we have. So, trying to wrap down a little bit. I'm trying leading you somewhere that I want to get to. What we believe, I believe as well, basically, and then the we comes to my program, is that climate change negotiations, as conducted by countries of the MENA region, is split between OPEC countries and non-OPEC countries. And OPEC countries are really afraid of what's going to happen with the carbon taxes and the reduction of reliance on fossil fuel and what that does to their economy. So they're bargaining from that position. And oftentimes, it is not in the interest of the non-OPEC countries in doing that. And this, having OPEC countries with a lot of economic power, they usually overpower the non-OPEC countries. And that pushes the interests of the non-OPEC MENA countries to the side. And oftentimes, even though Saudi Arabia, for example, now is speaking for the Arab League in the negotiations, they take the lead there, their interest is not necessarily that of Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, even Egypt and other countries, and Tunisia and other countries in our part of the world. So there should be a better coordination mechanism in place and the realization of the mutual interest of everybody to move forward on that. And so to do that, and even they realize it, in that they should diversify and shift away from fossil fuel. United Arab Emirates is trying to do that. The Saudis are trying also to do that. Morocco has started out with a huge solar farm. Jordan is really way advanced, much more advanced than many other countries in the Levant part of the Middle East in pushing solar. So that's on the global part. If you look at the regional and the national part, we really need to start generating generating knowledge and on the impacts of climate change and the vulnerabilities and the resilience that we need to build up. And we need to, and this is where I want to take you, is to adopt integrated holistic approach to adaptation and resilience, and namely through looking at the water energy food nexus. It's a new name to something that is called, in my mind, common sense. I mean, you have to look at water, you have to look at energy, you have to look at food. And I will just try to link it in the next couple of slides to show you what I mean. And I use this slide because everybody's really into health and fitness and whatnot. But look at the double pyramid that we have here. What we promote nowadays is to eat vegetables and fruits and the like. And the water footprint of such products is really very low compared to what we promote not to eat. Eat less meat, eat less chicken. And the water footprint of that is immense. There's 11 cubic meters of water to produce 1 kilogram of meat. So that's a whole lot. And just another one to look at, this is from, again, a study part of the study that we're doing at IFI, and we're looking at wheat yield and comparing it to oil prices in Lebanon. Wheat in Lebanon is an irrigated crop, and most of the irrigation water comes from groundwater, so we pump that. And to pump that, you need, at least before now, we relied heavily on fossil fuel. And as the oil prices went up, you could see that wheat yield went down because people irrigated less and less. Our problem nowadays, though, is that a lot of people are moving into solar-powered pumps, and that opens up water for, exploitation without any control of groundwater, and that is something that is, opening brackets here, that is of great concern for us. The reason that we work and push for the water energy food nexus, other than that it is common sense, it makes for greater ability to integrate with the SDGs and other countries' NDCs in meeting the Paris Agreement's commitments. So if we look at the water energy food nexus, the way they're all connected together, they account for 7 out of 17 SDGs. For example, water is for SDG 6. I don't know if you can read that. It's just clean water and sanitation, and SDG 3, which is good health and well-being. We need clean water for that. And when we look at food, it talks to SDG 2, which is ending hunger and achieving food security. And when we look at energy, it addresses SDG 7, and that ensures affordable and clean energy. So that's where we plug in renewables here and make it reliable and sustainable. And there are 3 cross-cutting goals that we have within this, and these are the first one, which is to end poverty. So if you manage to move forward with your common integrated approach, then people can get jobs in energy, can get jobs in the food sector. And what is critical, and if we look back at the first slide that we had, and it is making cities sustainable, cities and communities sustainable, especially that we have 60% and more of the Arab population living in cities. So we need to make sure that is addressed, and the water energy food nexus addresses that in various forms, and I hope Yasser and Aram can talk to that. And finally, we need to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns, because a lot of energy and waste are addressed by those. So can the water energy food nexus approach be implemented? Well, yes, this is our position, and we're working on it, and we have been a little bit successful, I would dare say. The League of Arab States launched a series of policy briefs advocating this. So the League of Arab States has bought into this, and they're pushing into using that. And they have done a series of policy briefs for the different components of it, We at AUB were part of this, and we laid down the background for this through a background paper that front-ended the policy briefs. And also with support from the Dutch government, we had launched a regional policy dialogue on implementing the water, energy, food nexus in the Levant countries. So we talked to Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine, and we had 2 meetings and of dialogue between these countries and within these countries, and also we presented our findings recently at the planetary security meeting in The Hague. The outputs so far are very encouraging. Iraq had started its water strategy, and what they have done is they wanted a review of it, and they bought into it. And the Minister of Water, Hassan Janabi, really bought into this, and he wants the review done on the strategy using the water, energy, food nexus as sort of a benchmark or a gauge to see if that strategy is well gauged. Lebanon's ministries of agriculture and energy and water, during one of those 2 meetings, they got close enough to agree on reviving a decree and then improving it and signing it so that wastewater treatment plants would then generate products that are usable, basically treated water, wastewater, the biosolids that come out of that, used as soil amendments and maybe fertilizers, and the biogas generated to produce energy. So there is your nexus in a shell. Jordan, as I had said, is way advanced, far ahead in terms of policies inland in their country on renewable energy, so they didn't really need much prodding on that. However, they are now pushing a Samra wastewater treatment plant, which treats, I think, 80% of Jordan's wastewater, is now being pushed to be totally self-sufficient in energy, and any excess would be sold on to the government at large. Is it possible? I mean, this is all theory, but in an assessment of the various institutions in Arab countries and on a national and a regional level, we found out that the institutions are really there. They don't need to create anything else to start this WEF approach. However, the only thing that is really needed is just a little bit better cooperation and coordination at an earlier stage in planning, in strategy development, and then communicating that to the various stakeholders at an earlier stage so that when moving forward, all stakeholders are accounted for in any strategy development. So with this, I will end and thank you. Turn it over to Anderson.
Can I just go?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, it's an honor to be here at the AUB in New York. I've been to the AUB offices in Beirut. Always likes it, where I met Nadim and Rami and others. So really, it's a pleasure. So I will try to perhaps comment a bit and build upon what Nadim has been saying, and also drawing my little intervention on a report we just released, and I brought a few copies here, not enough for everyone, but everything is available online, which is came out just a few months ago. Beyond Scarcity, it's a report looking at water security in the region. I even saw that you had at least one of the slides were coming from this book, which makes me very happy, being used in a good way. So I'll base it partly on that, and also on a book that I presented. Actually, the first presentation in the region was at the AUB at IFI, a bit 1.5 years ago maybe. So it's relatively fresh, but not completely. So building on the report and zooming in a little bit more on the water aspects, I'll highlight the key aspects that we were focusing on in the report, trying to be not only point a big picture, but also seeing where are the opportunities, where can we advance the agenda. So trying to find those areas, and I think I will build on what Nadim said, because he also pointed to some of them with the Nexus approach, reuse of wastewater, etc. But we actually basically asked ourselves three main questions when we went into this. Are water resources managed sustainably? How is the access in terms of services and access to water being delivered in the region? And are water-related risks recognized and mitigated? So those were the three sort of the core questions that guided the whole study. If we start with the resources as such, I think Nadim went into the details of it. It's the most water scarce region in the world. It has also, I'd like to add, it has depleting, and I think you touched upon it, groundwater levels. Not everywhere in the region, but in most parts of the region, not least in some of these countries that have been receiving refugees, such as Jordan, also Lebanon. The additional population has meant that they have had to draw more from their groundwater resources to cater for this increased need. So it's going down. It's in certain parts. If you look at Gaza, it's for long been well below what is sustainable, so which leads to saltwater intrusion, etc., etc. Also, if you look at water productivity, this region, you would think that, given that it's the most water scarce region and that should lead you to manage water in a good way, you'd think that the water productivity would be the highest. But actually, if you make a global comparison, it's the lowest in the world, in the region. Part of that is, of course, because a lot of water, as Nadim was rightly saying, goes to agriculture, which doesn't produce as much dollars per cubic meter used. But it's not the whole explanation. But you do have a variation. You have some countries with a very high water productivity in the region also. But that's like Qatar, Kuwait, Israel, UAE, the Gulf basically. But that's because they don't have so much natural resources. They produce at a high energy cost additional water that their economies are very non-agricultural focused. So that's part of that aspect. But then coming back to one of the things that you touched upon, and that's the recycling. And here I think we have a good opportunity. Our figures when we looked at the region, on the average, about 18% is treated. Of the wastewater is treated and reused in agriculture in the region, which is very low. Another 25% is treated and left it to the environment, that's not necessarily all bad, because you have a treated water flowing into the environment, which is of course better than the 57% that is just left untreated and ends up either in the sea or in wadis or just everywhere. So while 82% roughly is not recycled, that's of course alarming, but it represents an opportunity that could be utilized in order to increase the water availability in the region. We also looked at the diversification of the sources, and here reuse parts plays into this, but we looked at all the countries. I'll not give you all the details here, but the groundwater, how much is groundwater, how much is reused wastewater, how much is surface water, and ideally you should have a diversified, if possible, supply of water. And some countries do and some don't. In many countries, or a few in particular, like Libya in particular, they pump a lot of fossil groundwater, which is a bit like oil. When it's gone, it's gone. It's not renewable. So they are doing that, and there's some other resources, groundwater resources, in particular the Scarcity aquifer shared between Saudi Arabia and Jordan. It's also a fossil aquifer. When that's finished, it's finished. So that's yeah, I'm not here to judge saying that they shouldn't do it. Of course they should do it, but that's of course in the long run a significant challenge, and that needs to be overcome partly by reuse, but also by other resources. Then if we look at the services, there is disparity in the region, and we use the MDG, what was there before the SDG, to look at those data to see how much of water access is being provided in the countries. And on an average in the region, it's pretty high. But there are exceptions, especially the fragile, the conflict countries, especially now in the last few years, Syria, Yemen, obviously, Libya, Palestine is also challenging, at least in part, Iraq. So many challenges and remains there as well. And that leads to, coming back to the economic aspect, large economic losses because of a lack of inadequate water supply and sanitation. Because, as Nadim was saying, health is affected. You have lost work hours. You also have, that's a longer term effects on children. They get stunting, which is really they don't develop as they should. They also miss school, so the sort of the long-term consequences of that, not something we see now, but in 10, 20, 30 years, we may see that. And that will have economic consequences, of course, in addition to the human suffering. Then coming to the water-related risks, are they recognized, and if so, are they mitigated? I'd say that some are recognized and attempts to mitigate them, and some are not. Climate change, as Nadim was showing, is a major driver. At least, and in particular, in some countries in the region, not least Lebanon, Jordan, and the Mashriq countries, but also in other countries. And you have to deal with the increased heat waves, droughts and floods, etc. But it also links to another risk, and that's the transboundary aspect, which we don't delve into great depth here, but it's an important aspect. When you have a resource that is shared, and a lot of the surface water as well as the groundwater is shared between the countries, if you have more of an optimal management, you will be able to utilize it a bit better. So improving the cooperation between the countries is essential. We all know that this is a region where cooperation is a little challenging at times, and that the transboundary water is not an exception from this. There are a few agreements. You have agreements between Israel and Jordan. You have agreements between Syria and Jordan, for example. You have old agreements on the Nile, which are being discussed at quite some length these days, not the least. But even in the agreements that we have today, looking at the way they allocate water, it's a volumetric allocation. And what does that mean? It means that country X is supposed to get, say, 100 million cubic meters, as an example, and country Y 50. But with the climate change, as Nadim so clearly pointed out, the variations will increase, and some years you will have much more, some years you will have less. You will have it in certain parts of the year where you may not have had it before. So they don't cater usually. There are a few exceptions, but in the region generally not. They don't cater for the increased variation. So in that sense, the agreements in the few places where they exist may become obsolete from that perspective. And also coming back to the figures that Nadim was talking about on the effects of the economy, using Lebanon, I believe, as an example. And I think that corresponds very much to what the figures we have. That doesn't come through this study, but another study, High and Dry. It's also I can also recommend that focuses on the climate change and the economic effects of it. And this region is by far the one that will be affected most. So we're talking about a loss between 6 to 14% of GDP, up to 2055 now, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a massive challenge economically for the region. Some of which could be mitigated, but not all. So really, it's a major challenge that needs to be dealt with. Finally, I'd just like to support Nadim's view that his conclusion that the water, energy, food nexus. It's common sense. We in the bank are trying to look much more into this as well and seeing where can we support that in the best way, where the governments come to us and also for support in trying to implement this. We're very happily looking at it, and it represents a massive opportunity as well. Ending on a positive note here as well for further development. So while there are many challenges, not all is doom and gloom. I'd say there are opportunities which we would like to capture with the countries involved. Thank you.
Thank you. Aram and Yasser, we'd love to have you comment, and then we'll open up the floor for discussion.
Okay, yeah, so we'll start with, thank you very much for these interesting interventions. So we'll start with, Yasser is going to have a brief intro, and then he will go ahead with his part, and I will kind of conclude with mine.
Hi everyone. Thank you Nadim and Andrea for your very informative and I think great background for my presentation and Aram's as well. And I think that as landscape architects, as architects and planners, our concern is very much connected to the physical environment that we really address, and that includes the urban and the landscape dimension. When we talk about resilience and urban resilience, and I will focus a little bit my discussion on cities as well. In addition to all the impacts that Nadim mentioned, from drought, flooding and so forth, the nature of cities, the physical nature of cities really exacerbates these impacts. For example, if we're talking about increased temperatures, within cities because of the urban heat island, temperatures are much higher. Your runoff or your flooding is twice, doubled in its impact. And if you look at the context of the Arab world, already our temperatures are much higher than a lot of cities all across the world. So imagine if our temperatures are going 1 or 2 degrees, our cities are going to be either hotter, and much more difficult to navigate. So, if we look at cities, in addition to the environmental impacts, when we talk about cities, we automatically talk about people. And, there's a whole concept of vulnerability when we talk about resilience, vulnerability of communities. And that's extremely important because, we tend to focus so much on the environmental dimension and we tend to miss at some point, the issues of people. And, in cities are big attractors, economic or, internal migration, but as well, specifically to the Arab world, especially during these periods, we've got the civil strife. And we know very well, if we take Lebanon as an example, with a population of 4.5 million, we have close to 1 million refugees from the recent events in Syria. So, when we look at the urban environment, there is much to do there, coupled with, in addition to the environmental dimension. So planning all of this becomes a little bit, challenging, specifically, I think, as Andrea has talked about the, the difficulties of cooperation across different political systems and governance systems. So I will just move a little bit and just present a bit my personal work, and connected to these topics and to adaptation, and I'll just take you through 2 or 3 themes that I think are relevant to what we're talking about here. In the past couple of years, I've worked on on 2 areas related to urban adaptation. I'm looking at planning frameworks. One that we call the windows of opportunity that addresses uncertainty. And then the second one is in collaboration with an NSF grant with the University of Massachusetts and some Caribbean countries and some EU partners looking at coastal resilience. And here we're, with these ideas, we're trying to completely reconceptualize what infrastructure is. Typically, infrastructure, when we think of it, we only talk about roads, hard engineered infrastructure. And in our conception to bring in the social, cultural dimension to all of this, we've came up with a 7-pronged idea with the idea of gradients that really talk about this variability rather than this very distinct and clear, very static approach to looking at a situation. So in many ways, looking at these alternative planning approaches in urban planning can account for the uncertainty that we're talking about in the future. I'm looking at how do we actually, one of the big challenges in planning is how do we mainstream all this adaptation work that we're trying to do, or urban resilience, into already set up systems. And if we look into the future, this becomes really a challenge, because as we all know, not everyone, most of us don't like to change, and thinking of urban resilience will require us to really flip upside down the way we look at cities. We cannot look at them as something as a static that's fixed in time. We really need to look at them as dynamic and ever-changing. We cannot, we talk about projections, but we have no clue if these projections are going to materialize the way we do. So a lot of what these frameworks that we're working on are very much about flexibility, about adaptive systems. And I think, a little bit here, and I think the work with IFI, with Nadeem as well, that we're working on urban informal systems, really comes into these ideas. Going more into something a bit more specific, I'm also working on green infrastructure systems, which are usually nature-based systems for climate adaptation. And in temperate climates, looking at Europe and the US, where it rains pretty well, and there's abundance of water, looking at natural systems to really do the infrastructural work could be thought of in a much easier manner. But it becomes a bit challenging when we're talking about desert cities or arid cities or water-scarce cities. Actually, I'm collaborating with Aram as well on this project, and we have a project that's also in collaboration with UC Davis that is also supported by a developer from Dubai, and the title of the project is Greener Cities Are Cooler Cities. And we're looking actually at the impact of urban heat islands, and it's a multi-scalar study where we compare, actually three areas. It's divided into 3 parts. One is looking at comparing the urban heat island of 8 arid cities across the world and looking at the contribution of green infrastructure, or let's talk about vegetation and how much they can actually cool or reduce the urban heat island effect. We're also looking at residential typologies as a solution or a way to actually increase vegetative cover, and definitely here taking into consideration adapted plants, low water, needs for the plants, low water irrigation, as well as going down to the side scale at the human comfort level. We also have set up some climatic units that are set up in Dubai, that we have live streaming data that's coming in that with different typologies of different vegetation, looking at water content, temperatures, humidity, and so forth, and see actually how these different vegetation typologies can actually contribute to changing the urban climate, or actually, reducing the heat. And the significance of all of this comes from, you might ask, so who cares if we can extend the use of the outdoor climate by 1 or 2 or 3 weeks or 1 month? And that's partly what we're trying to do. If a person spends a bit more time outdoors because it's a bit more comfortable, it means I would spend less time indoor, especially if we look at Dubai or the Gulf areas, which means that I will use less AC, I will consume less electricity, which means I will release less carbon, releases into the environment. And that's one way, even if it's small steps, it will contribute to the bigger picture of addressing climate change. Another project that we've worked on, and this is all from a planning design perspective, that I worked with also a student of mine, looking at neighborhood domestic water usage. And we tried to compare in Beirut, you get your government water, which comes probably only maybe 2 hours, a day. But we all depend on bottled water that's delivered to our homes. And these are actually informal system, private companies that actually take over this whole water infrastructure system. But what we're trying to do is compare the actual expenditure of domestic homes on, how much they spend on buying their own water, and then how much they actually pay for government. And it turns out they pay 4 to 6 times more what they're supposed to be paying. And this comes very much from one dimension, partly is less water, but again, we go back to this cooperation idea and the governance dimension, which we really cannot forget when we're talking about urban resilience or climate change in general, because it requires specific policies, strong governance to act in or push in any type of decision that is decided, and that's a pretty difficult thing to actually do in the Arab world. I will close out a little bit with, and then give the floor to Aram with a couple of actually initiatives that we've actually applied grants for, and they actually connect to all of this. One, taking up the project from Dubai, looking at vegetated systems. We've applied for a grant that's trying to use drones with sensors to really try and look at the impact of vegetation towards the urban climate. And what's important about this compared to static climatic units is that you can actually measure the heat exchange or the energy exchange that happens within the urban climate and gives us a more dynamic assessment of the situation. And all of this is to inform basically policies on how to actually use vegetation to really reduce all of these. The other project that we're actually trying to work on, and that's in collaboration with Nadeem as well, is trying to look at green walls on buildings to try and use recycling of domestic water to actually bring it back into the building use. There's much more we can talk about, but I think
thanks again, everyone, for giving me this opportunity to be part of this interesting discussion. I'll be building a bit on, so Nadeem mentioned population increase in this area. He addressed the issue of urbanization, the increase in the rate of urbanization, which is really very high at this point. And this is affecting the temperature rise in our settlements, let's say, or in our cities. When we look at this, I will focus on the issue of energy as associated with these aspects, and the research that we're doing at AV here that I'm involved in relates to multiple scales. I'll start a bit with the urban scale, whereby one study is we're calling it Beirut Whole. So this is Beirut Pollution and Energy Dynamic Model. It's really looking at the urban heat island effect in the context like Beirut, so these elevated temperatures that are existing in the city. And we're looking at the dynamic behavior between the urban heat island effect and its relationship or its association with air pollution. We have taken one particular neighborhood, which represents an example of an urban morphology of Beirut. So the typology of buildings, the spatial occupation of the buildings, as well as the direction of the streets and the proportions of the negative spaces are, to a certain extent, representative of the greater Beirut area. And we're looking at, so depending on the urban heat island effect, and depending on the local climatic factors, so solar radiation, wind flow, etc., what is the relationship between the amount of heat as well as the generation of air pollution? And more importantly, how is this air pollution dissipated throughout the different areas and the different neighborhoods? So this is an interesting study because it really informs policymakers in terms of given that a city is a living entity, that a building may live for 60, 80, or 100 years. The city will live for centuries, if not millennia. So what are the planning policies that could be integrated into the future planning of a city to decrease the negative impact of air pollution, particularly as related to the urban fabric and the urban morphology that we have in our local cities? The interesting thing about this study is that we're treating it as a test case whereby the methodology could be applicable to other cities. And that's what makes it really interesting in terms of dissipation and scope. Another study is looking at the existing and simulated building energy use in Beirut. So we have gathered from the only local agency, all the information about the energy use in buildings, so mainly related to the electricity consumption. And we have modeled the whole city of Beirut in 3D digital format, and we have identified the building typology and the year of construction of these buildings. And we're looking at, again, the association between energy consumption and electricity consumption in these buildings as related to the year of construction and as related to different times of day and different times of year. There's a very interesting correlation between when is energy used in a city and for what purpose, and what is the reason behind that, and how could we eventually benefit from, so once we understand this dynamic behavior of the consumption profile, how can we actually forecast better and more efficient usage of energy at the city scale? So different parts of the city are using more or less extent of energy depending on time of day and time of year. A third study is in fact addressing, this is more related to the design aspect of things. So we're looking at optimizing building form. There's a very interesting relationship between the shape of a building and how much energy is used to actually cool a building in our context. So because it's particularly warm and hot and temperatures are rising, we're more interested in cooling buildings. So how is the shape, how can we design building shapes so that they actually require less energy to cool? And this is really working with the integrated design approach. So we have different people of different disciplines and different professional backgrounds involved in this study to really look at the multiple aspects associated with building design. This issue is also, I should state, addressing the outdoor space. Okay, so I'm referring to, I mentioned buildings, but in fact we're also interested in the outdoor, in the negative space that is between buildings. And this is kind of combined with some initiatives I'm working on with Yasser. A very important aspect when we talk about energy in buildings is that some buildings are being built today, but the majority of energy usage is due to the existing building stock. So this is a very important aspect to look at. And again, this is a study with Yasser whereby we're looking at at buildings that were built in different time intervals in the city, so 1920s, 1940s, 1980s, assessing the comfort conditions indoors and again, associating that with the performance of the building envelope. So insulation levels, heat flow through the building envelope, the facade as well as the roof. And the interest here is to come up with policies or guidelines or recommendations on what needs to be done to really alleviate and reduce the energy usage of these buildings, because in principle they consume a lot of energy in the city. I'll end with a particularly interesting study, which is again dealing with the construction typology. So we're looking at building in different methods. So to reduce reliance on cement and concrete, given the harm that they cause the environment, and we're looking at earth construction typology, earth as a standalone material or even as a hybrid configuration, whereby we could rely more on natural resources, on the resources that we have on site, use them to build a particular building, especially in more remote areas. In order to ensure, I will end with this statement, to ensure and promote maximum penetration into the industry, into society at large. We're involved in several initiatives and we collaborate with numerous agencies. I will name the Ministry of Public Works, Ministry of Environment, the Order of Engineers and Architects, LIBNOR, which is the national agency that actually produces all the codes and standards locally, as well as the Lebanon Green Building Council. So all these collaborative initiatives are in place, and we really put in a lot of effort and time to promote these initiatives so that we can ensure, or at least try to penetrate as much as possible into the market and into the professional body. Despite these efforts, and these initiatives, the implementation still lacks the strategic global vision that, in principle, should be put in place or provided by proper government. So, having said that, a lot of what is being done remains based on the initiative generated by particulars, by companies, or by confined agencies, and not the overall government. So, I finish my intervention with this note. How would you like us to proceed? At this point, we could maybe take some questions on your side or on this side, or some remarks.
Yes, thank you, Aram and Yasser. And I would like to open it for questions and comments on either side. And perhaps, Aram, you could moderate it on that side. If someone has something to say, ask them to introduce themselves and
Sure.
comment. Do we have anything from this room?
Well, first, it seems like it's such a multifaceted issue. There's so many different angles from which somebody can think about ways to mitigate climate change. But it seems like the most powerful way would be not to discount anything as far as green buildings, but would come from the back end where you're producing electricity in such a way as to that doesn't produce. So it doesn't matter how much the building uses because the electricity production itself isn't generating carbon dioxide. But is there, among all these different initiatives that are tackling climate change from these different angles, is there one that's kind of the most, if there was only, if instead of a multifaceted strategy, you just had to target one area of for tackling this problem, one initiative, one very singularly focused initiative, what would that be? What would be the one pointed sort of tip of the spear to come at the climate change problem from, rather than thinking about every single facet?
So much for holistic.
Just my 2 cents. Sadly, there isn't a magic bullet, I think. And listening to the presentations, the interventions from Beirut, I also came to think, and you were on it, although maybe you didn't use those words, but energy efficiency together with green energy like solar and all of this. My view is that has to go together, because otherwise we will produce, if we focus on solar or renewable, if it's wind or solar or all of that, but do not have energy efficient buildings, etc., we will be producing it not in vain necessarily, but we need to do it together in order to make most use of the green energy that we are producing. So sorry, I would like it to be some magic bullet, but I haven't seen it yet. But maybe Nadim has.
In my dreams. No, I don't believe there's it's the wrong way of thinking about it. There's not one thing. If you focus on one thing, you're dropping everything else. That's why we're promoting or pushing that we approach things in an integrated, holistic manner where you look at everything and then promote that. Because if you promote energy conservation without looking at water conservation or land productivity, water productivity, all of these in concert, you are going to lose out somewhere, and you're invariably going to drop the ball somewhere. In our part of the world, even though per capita use of, for example, in Lebanon, we're above average in per capita emissions of greenhouse gases. The issue is we're not a drop in the bucket in terms of total emissions. And we are at the receiving end. I mean, our vulnerability is very high. So we really cannot address one aspect of our vulnerability. It's an entire grouping. So we have to start ensuring that we reduce vulnerability, build up our resilience, and through that, we work on the co-benefits, if you will. Energy efficiency produces better air quality, which produces better living standards, or living conditions, let's say. And you can save some money on that. So that's one, one track that you follow. But what do you do when you don't have enough water? Or what if you use all your energy that you have saved in pumping up this groundwater that you have, and in a few years' time, what do? You have no more water, you have to desalinate, and that creates further problems down the road.
I know.
If I may ask,
Yes, go ahead.
this is Yasser speaking. If I may add a bit to Andrea and Nadim's perspective and responding if there is really one big solution with a capital T for climate change. I think we also need to think of it. I think, the underlying messages here is that when you look at climate change, there are two things to address or approaches. One is mitigation, and that's really one simple solution, cut down on CO2. How do you go about it? You've got the Paris Agreement and so forth. But there's also adaptation, and where, you really recognize, as Nadeem was saying, we are at the receiving end. We really have no control what comes at us. We can control our own emissions, if we get our act together. But, what do we receive? There's really nothing we can do about it, but simply to address it and really cope with it. And coping with it and coping with those stresses is very contextual in the sense that, the way I adapt in Lebanon is going to be a bit different than the way I adapt in Saudi Arabia and so forth. So, just falling back to what Nadeem finished with, there's really no one solution at the adaptation level. At the mitigation, it's very simple. We need to cut down CO2, but how do we go about doing it? And the politics comes in at a completely different level between the receiving and the giving. And really, this is where, it's a full, negotiation game. But, there's really no one solution. That's the bottom line.
One second. Anyone else in the room like to comment on this?
I have a question. Did you say that Saudi Arabia is using 65% of its oil production to clean its? You did? Was that to desalinate?
Local energy.
Is that
Local energy use 65% goes to
desalinate water?
Desalinating, yes.
All right, so that's extraordinary. I mean, at least in my opinion. So, so in your research or in your opinion, what would be the next best way to either to desalinate water, or what's the next best alternative to using oil? Or what else are they exploring?
Let me start with the back end. They're desalinating to get water.
Uh-huh.
Most Gulf countries, on average, use around 600 liters per person per day. That is equivalent to, or more than what the US citizens use. And in parts of the Middle East, it's around 150 liters per person per day. So we should start with reducing that use. And then once you get to some level that is manageable, then you can start, and if then the energy use is still problematic, then you have to find other means. The reason we're pushing for the water energy food nexus on a regional level is that there are countries in the region that are water rich. We can start with Sudan, for example. But Sudan has a lot of water. It used to have, when it was big Sudan, now it's small Sudan. It used to have energy as well. So smaller Sudan would want energy, and then that is where there could be an exchange. The water does not necessarily have to go in terms of form of water to Saudi Arabia. It could go as virtual water in terms of produce. Saudi Arabia does not have to produce wheat as they were doing. They are stopping it now. They are also reducing a lot potato production but they're still producing lots of alfalfa for their integrated dairy farms, which is another really weird thing to do because they are using air conditioning for their barns so that cows keep producing at a high rate, milk at a high rate. So there is your other problem. So they're increasing their emission, they're increasing their through desalination, energy production for cooling, and also for pumping groundwater. Fossil water in Saudi Arabia is found at 2 kilometer depth. It is nearly 80 degrees Celsius. And it comes up, it needs to be cooled, and as it cools, you lose a lot to evaporation. So of the water that you get, that you pump out, you lose a lot as well. So that's another twist to the story.
And just a small addition to the point about the high levels of water use. If we look, and I didn't get into that, but we've also looked at the subsidies to water, rather the prices for water. And really in the Middle East, North Africa region, we pay close to zero for the provision of water. It's partly cultural, religious, etc. Reasons for this, it's seen as it's a public good to have the water. But that also is not very helpful if you want to get at exactly decreasing the water consumption. Because this, in the Gulf countries, is the highest water consumption in the world. And you would think that, well, how is that even possible, given the scarcity? But it is. So there's a lot to do that you can do with economic incentives, etc. Especially in those richer countries where the money is there and the water prices are very low.
We have 2 comments here and we have one online, and then we'll go to you, or if you have some in that room, but Megan, you have something.
Hi, I'm curious, what are some of the ways that you think you could get a city like Beirut to buy in implementing some changes?
I think Yasser and Aram will jump in on this as well. But at the end of the day, it's all about money. If you show clear savings in terms of expenditure for the government, local government, the municipality, or the central government, that is one great aspect. So you really need to push on savings and show that there are clear savings. And going back to what Anders is saying, the subsidy issue, it is phenomenal. I was talking to my friends here in the US. They pay what, $80 a month as a water bill. In Beirut, we pay close to $200 a year to get water delivered to our house. So the way you are structuring your tariff and how much you pay for your water, that's one issue. The other issue clearly is subsidy. And sometimes subsidies are masked by subsidizing well equipment so that you can construct a well and get it up and running. And nobody is subsidizing water itself, it's just that they're subsidizing the well. So there's that play. So if we start putting in valorizing, if you will, water in its true sense, then you can cut down on energy consumption and water consumption as well. And then that feeds into more productivity of water, more productivity of land, etc. onto that.
We have one comment here to your right.
Yeah, I'm Richard Seeger. I'm a climate scientist at Columbia University Montevideo Observatory. It's very interesting to listen to all this. I've read I want to get back to the issue of the transboundary water agreements. I've read that within the Jordan Basin, Israel and Jordan have worked quite effectively to reduce the flows there. But I'm wondering, for the Tigris-Euphrates basins, given the conflicts in all the countries, how are the water agreements between Turkey, Syria and Iraq that govern those river flows holding up right now? Or are they completely gone?
So there are some bilateral sort of agreements, but there is no overall framework that covers the whole basin, including Syria, Turkey, Iraq. I mean, even Iran is part of the basin. So there really isn't much. There are initiatives to promote improved cooperation, and there is coordination going on, but it's very low level. There is a need, I would say, of improving that. But that's, of course, it's challenging now with the situation in Syria. But even so, it's proven to be challenging also with the others. So there is. I mean, you're onto something very important here, but there really isn't an overarching agreement. There's some small pieces of agreements, agreements of sorts.
Yes, and if I may add, the issue on agreements is that they're not governed by any international convention. I mean, the Helsinki Convention or the UN Convention on the non-navigable use of waters, transboundary waters, is not adhered to by Turkey. Turkey is not a co-signatory on that. So, and the approach has been by Turkey of, I'm the headwaters state. I control what I can, and that is causing some issues in the area. Syria's discharge of the Orontes into Turkey was controlled by an agreement between Turkey and Syria. To a great extent, that was observed until now it's fallen apart. We heard from Iraq that what they used to get in terms of water directly into Iraq through the Tigris and the Euphrates, now they're getting in as food import. So they're paying for the food rather than getting that water out of it, with all the ramifications. So it is rather problematic. And the deal between Israel and Jordan isn't that good a deal, by the way. Or else it wouldn't have necessitated the looking into the other sources of water for the Jordanians and for the Palestinians of the West Bank. So the entire riparian issue is still up for grabs. Lebanon and Syria are headwater countries for the Jordan, and they have not been involved in any of the dealings between Jordan and Israel. So that still needs to be worked some more as well.
Do we have any?
Just to add, Nadeem, also, I mean, you've got the Jordan River and the Orontes River coming out of Lebanon, and we really have no control as we're controlling the headwaters, but both, the agreement with Syria is very disadvantageous for Lebanon going to the Orontes, and as you said, we have no say in the Jordan River. And there's just to add to the whole discussion that it's really a pretty big mess.
Yeah, it's a might is right approach. Let's follow.
I mean, optimally, ideally, you should have a multilateral agreement that includes all the riparians. That's for political reasons. That's not possible. Is what you're saying. I mean, there are 5 riparians, including the Palestinians on the Jordan, but that's for all the political reasons.
Yeah, that's another story.
Not happening. Yeah, that would necessitate a couple of days to discuss that.
Yes, hi. I'm Miriam Khiari from Tunisia, and thank you so much for this interesting presentation. Growing as a daughter of an agriculture in Tunisia, I lived all my life when I was young in Tunisia with this question coming from my father: please go and see if it rains outside. So because it's very, very interesting for us, as he's as I said, he's in agriculture, and it's about wheat, about cereals. So listening to you saying, please, Andrew, that groundwater, if that Libya, our close neighbor, is using the groundwater and it's harming, there is any problem to the neighborhood? I think the neighbor's country, is it the same groundwater that they are using, and I don't know, is it in the agreement, UN agreement?
Okay, yeah, good question. I mean, what we haven't talked about so much about is the aspect of rainwater, which was where you started. That's also another potential source of improved yield for irrigation. If you manage your rainwater better, which is going to be harder at the same time with climate change because of variability, but you could do some. I mean, in Ramallah, for example, it rains as much as in London. on an annual average. So there is, and they do capture part of that. There's an opportunity to do more. That was not your question. So let's get to the groundwater question. So the Libyans are pumping in what they call the Great Man-Made River from the south of Libya, and the fossil aquifer. Part of, I mean, there's some debate as far as I'm concerned. I'm not an expert on this, on the you know. So I'm a political scientist. I know check the politics, but I'm not an expert on how it actually looks. But there's some debate in saying that this is partly shared with the neighbors. But mainly primarily it's an internal Libyan fossil aquifer that's being announced. It doesn't affect. But then you have the name escapes me.
Nubian.
Yeah, the Nubian sandstone aquifer, which is shared with Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria.
And Egypt.
Yes, and Egypt as well. Yes. So there is an institution, OSS, who is dealing with this. There's not a full-fledged agreement on that as well. So often what we have observed when looking at transboundary waters is that for the surface water, not always, and not necessarily in the MENA region, there are agreements, but for groundwater there are less. There are agreements, but there are less agreements. Partly because it's invisible, sort of. You don't see what you don't see. You don't necessarily manage all that well. So there's a lot to do also on these aspects.
Even in the United States, we don't have groundwater regulation. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We have a question online. Would it be possible to foresee research to even more organically integrate the two sectors, urban and rural land, for food supply?
Yes.
We have a yes.
Well, we didn't hear the last part.
Okay. Would it be possible to foresee research to even more organically integrate the two sectors, urban and rural land use, for food supply? It's a mouthful.
Sure.
That's an interesting question, definitely. I'm not sure I have an answer, but theoretically, yes, you can integrate because number one, cities don't exist in voids. They actually exist within a landscape. A lot of cities actually exist within agricultural landscapes. So, I mean, if you look at it from a regional planning perspective, and if you look at it from a land use perspective, yes, there is, at least theoretically, to look at that. For example, I know in Morocco, in Casablanca, there was a whole research project that was funded by the EU that worked on the mega cities, and Casablanca was chosen as one. And urban agriculture was chosen as the main driver of the urban development. And if you look at urban agriculture, that actually extended towards the rural areas as a whole continuum of food production. But here again, it's not only for food production, but the idea of food energy nexus comes into the game. Because again, you really cannot think of all of this without thinking of the energy dimension and the water dimension. So in many ways, looking at it, it's about increasing the lens, the way we look at things. We could really zoom in at the micro scale, but it's all about the perspective that we look at things. And yes, it can be integrated, but it requires the politics, the will, the awareness, and first the acceptance that we really might be going to a pretty bad situation with food security connected to climate change. So I think it's possible, but how, that becomes the big question.
I want to add to what Yasser is saying. A lot of the approaches that we're pushing for in terms of urban water, energy, food nexus rely on developing food sources within the urban setting. And some research has gone into the vertical agriculture, where it's like, instead of having the car parks in buildings, you can have vertical agriculture. In addition to the outside, the vertical walls and the rooftop gardens, that's another issue. But the vertical agricultural approach is one that can be pushed forward. It can be totally Nexus, if you will, with water coming in from reuse of harvesting rainwater, reuse of treated wastewater, energy from solar panels, etc., and producing locally. So that can happen as space is squeezed out of cities and cities can grow vertically up. That's one major option that should be looked into and has been looked into, but not as intensively as it should be. So that's one answer.
We have about 5 minutes, and we have another question online. This takes us in a new direction. How would cryptocurrency mining affect this discussion? Energy-hungry areas are expected to exceed the current cumulative energy spending. How would cryptocurrency mining affect this discussion?
It's yours.
No, don't you do the work back, you're the work back.
Send it to me.
You've got the bang exactly.
We're tossing this to you, Beirut.
Oh boy.
No, we're not getting any
Well,
comments.
actually, I asked this question. I just posted it online. Rami Farran here. Yeah, I mean, I've always been reading about the energy consumption that's predicted for the cryptocurrency mining, which is exponentially increasing in the past, let's say, 2 years. And how would this affect all the different energy spending and eventually affecting the climate changes, whether it's in the region or not? Because in the region, the main attraction is the low cost of energy generation, given the black gold. So it's a very targeted area for building the plant for cryptocurrency mining.
I won't touch that.
No, I
Sorry, Rami. I mean, it's beyond
It's beyond my knowledge.
my knowledge. Way beyond my knowledge.
I think I'd like to.
Sorry, Alison, could we take a question or an intervention on this side?
Yes. If you can keep it to a few minutes, yes.
Sure. So could you please introduce?
Hello, my name is Nora. I am a graduate student at the agriculture, working among plant pathology. My intervention is related to food supply and how to increase it. We're trying as an agricultural engineer to shift the production without using pesticides and using or depending more on cultivated pest management and organic production. And here we are concerned because with the climate change, we have increased minimum temperature and lower humidity. So applying this technique is getting more hard, and thus treating diseases and pests will be also harder. But my question is, we set an example about yellow rust that decreased the yield of wheat from 20 to 50%. So how come this happens if we have more drought and less humidity with a higher temperature? This is my question.
Okay. It's not necessarily less humidity, actually. In coastal areas, you will get higher humidity because of the elevated temperature, and you'll get that feed in from the sea. There's a part of the drought study that we had done. We had looked into evapotranspiration in 2 parts of Lebanon. One in the inland northeastern part of Lebanon, which is really dry, and then we looked in the Kura area, which is along the coast, and the rate at which evapotranspiration we saw it increase, basically due to temperature increase, was mitigated to some extent by the higher relative humidity that is associated with rising temperature along the coast. But still, the conditions are favorable when you get a little bit higher humidity and the warmth. the problem with diseases may not be just the rust. The rust occurred in Syria and Turkey and Iraq, basically due to the increase in precipitation that they had at the end of the drought. The rain came in very hard and the temperature was high. So, and then also the varieties of wheat that were used were not, they were at the very end of their cycle, if you will, and they were much more susceptible to rust. Dr. Ojadi is with you, I can see him, he knows tons more than I do. So I defer to him as always on that. But still, diseases, especially insect-borne diseases, I understand Dr. Nasr Kawar is online and he can talk to this a whole lot. He's a walking encyclopedia on insects in the Middle East, so we can make always good use of Dr. Kawar. And the thing is, higher temperatures extend and increase the cycle of the life of insects, and these insects, in the same way that climate change affects our health, it affects also plant health in the same manner.
I think, unfortunately, we've run out of time, and I wonder if our four speakers today could each give a sort of quick statement as to where you see some hope in the work that you're doing right now, where if you had to just categorize it today, you'd say, all right, I see hope right over here, a little bit of progress. Maybe could we start with you, Yasser, and then Aram?
Yeah, sure. I think the hope in all of this in addressing not only climate change or any challenge, I think it simply boils down to people's will. And I think a lot of the people in the Middle East, and I know from firsthand in Lebanon, that there is an innate level of resilience that keeps pushing people forward. I truly believe in that, and I think hope resides there at any level.
Thank you. Aram?
So I'd like to mention that given all that is said, I really believe that it's a matter of governance. Governance is key in advancing with this subject and getting somehow out of this negative cycle that we are caught up in. And there are initiatives that are being done, and I think that having more of these initiatives and more broader applications and implementation is kind of a way out, especially when we think of it in a holistic and broad manner.
Thank you. Anders?
Okay, thank you. Well, building on this, I have 3 points, I think, where opportunities lie. So, in valuing water, meaning looking at subsidies reform, etc., giving fair value to the water in the region. The opportunity of reuse of treated wastewater in agriculture. And then the third point would be the water, energy, food nexus and the opportunity that lies there. Thank you.
Okay. I'm an eternal optimist to a fault, and there are all in every bad situation, and we've been through a lot in the Middle East, something good always comes out. So something will come out good of this. And what I've been seeing is that the new generation coming up are much more aware of climate change and the need to address this issue. And this generation is growing into government and as well as influencing government. Even though most countries in the Middle East are not really democracies, but they are not listening to the people. So there is that now awareness amongst governments that something has to be done, and something is being done. We use the example of the Iraqis looking into their water strategy with a different outlook. We're looking at how the Lebanese ministries are pushing through this integrated approach, and the reaching out and the cooperation is there. So amongst universities, I can attest to this. In Lebanon, we have reached out to many universities and have the reaching out is reciprocated many folds over. That is happening, as well as now we're able to not only reach out, and we are falling back on our ancient connection to the US. But now with Europe is coming in as well with us for that. So this whole thing is developing, and what has happened at Paris, the Paris Agreement, is really for us a launching pad. It's not an end of itself, it's a launching pad, it's the start of a new era where everybody is pitching in. So yeah, that's where I want to stop.